Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Adam Berger. I am the Chief Information Security Officer at Netrix. Thank you for joining us today for our roundtable discussion on how to secure and govern generative AI. And with many uses of AI being explosive across the industry, we have a lot of companies implementing AI in all sorts of their technology, everywhere to enable their business more effective. You've got many IT and IT security teams left grappling on how to enable their business and then how to effectively also apply security around what is already out there. And in many cases, the enablement of AI actually came first, and now you have a security team quickly trying to catch up and how to put effective security measures around that. Today, we're actually going to focus specifically on Gen AI. That's an area that Netrix is seeing with many of our clients, where there's an ask there and there's a need there for figuring out how to apply effective security. And to help us with that conversation, we have two awesome SMEs here on the call today to go through these topics in more detail. We have Rich Lilly, who is a technologist, field CTO at Netrix for security. Rich brings over 25 years of consulting experience. He's also a leading SME in Microsoft security, compliance, and identity. And he is also a Gen AI security thought leader and is doing a lot of more modernized talks around how to place effective security around Gen AI. And so, Rich, appreciate you joining us today. Also, we have Mike Truce with us today, who is a principal security advisor with our CISO practice. And Mike has a huge background, 35 years of IT and InfoSec experience as a practitioner and leader across a variety of industries, retail, entertainment, military defense, and manufacturing. And Mike is really going to help us focus on the governance topic today as well. So appreciate you guys joining us. And so to get us started, AI is a wide topic, right? So, and securing AI is even maybe a deeper topic, right? And so we, as I mentioned to kick the call off, we are going to focus on Gen AI specifically. So hoping to have Mike just give us a little bit of a quick level set on AI versus Gen AI. What are the differences? Why are we focusing on Gen AI today to get us started?
Yeah, sure, Adam. I think that so for being just two letters, AI is really a big alphabet soup. There's so many different angles on it, but I like to look at it from two major categories. So one by capability. So that the first is narrow AI, general AI, and super AI. So narrow is it's relatively weak. General AI is a stronger version. That's the stuff most of us deal with every day. And then we have super AI, and this is the stuff that's being built that supposedly, surpasses human intelligence in a lot of ways. So that's my capability. But what we're really talking about today, when we say Gen AI, is really by application or by model type. And there's a small handful of types that are out there. So the first is machine learning, and people regularly kind of confuse AI and machine learning, but it's really a subset of AI. The next is language processing, natural language processing. So think chatbot. Next is generative AI. That's what we're going to talk about today. So this is the means to create content out of large data models. Think GTP. Think DALL-E, think those big types of systems where you go ask to have a picture of your dog riding a motorcycle or whatever the case might be. That's where that stuff comes from. Next is expert systems. So this is really systems that are focused on decision making, computer vision. So think image or facial recognition, and then the last one is expert systems.
Thanks, Mike, for helping us differentiate a bit. And as you mentioned and reinforced, Gen AI is the topic today. And let's dive into it a little bit of Mike. You do a lot of client-facing work. Why should security leaders really care about Gen AI and application security around it, right? It's a new topic in the industry. It's been out, it is emerging, it's out of the box already. And now security leaders are either catching up or maybe scratching their heads. So can you give us a little bit of just, from your perspective, why we should be looking at this as security leadership and what are some of the things we should be considering in there?
Yes, I will. So the first thing I want to impress on everybody, and for those who don't know this, this is something you really need to pay attention to. And if you already do, then put more effort into it. This is not a fad, okay? You need to embrace now on all aspects of this, because we were having a kind of a fun conversation yesterday talking about, what is AI and, why should we even bother worrying about it? And we all know that IT people and InfoSec people, I don't want to say we have short attention spans, but usually it's the big shiny thing that comes along. Well, this is a UFO. Okay. This isn't like just one thing. This is a really, really big, interesting piece of technology that's coming down the pipe. And you're going to need to embrace it because it's here to take over the world. And the thing that you're going to be pressed on by your business is the fact that it's going to make our businesses better. It's going to make us more, we're going to move faster. We're going to be more efficient. We're going to be able to do things we never were able to do before because of all this compute power. That's the good news. The bad news is there's just tons of opportunity for data leaks, data damage, privacy concerns, so many things that we worry about today. But now with Gen AI coming, these are magnified by orders of magnitude at a minimum.
It's a great highlight, Mike, just in terms of it's not going away, right? So your concept of or your comment about embracing, right? The companies are pushing on it, or it's going to come, and the faster security leadership can kind of get in here, get an understanding of why it's being used and how they can integrate to that. The faster you're going to be able to put strategy around it, right? And so it's kind of moving the topic over to Rich here. When we get into the often in the security space, we get into the seek to understand, right? And Gen AI may be no different, but it is a bit unique in terms of what the technology is and why people are needing to use it in their companies. And so, can you kind of walk us through maybe some ways that you've seen with your client interactions, or how you've approached seeking to understand and the importance of that as it comes related to Gen AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the bigger challenges is that a lot of we're kind of in this funny time, as Mike was alluding to, where a lot of folks know they want to use it, but they don't really know how they want to use it. So a lot of times we've seen kind of a lot of variations of this. One variation is that business comes to IT and says, we need to use Gen AI. That's kind of full end of the conversation. Then it's kind of up to the IT teams and the business, the outside business leaders to kind of figure that out. I think one of the challenges there is there's not really any guidance. So that's kind of one thing that has to be figured out. I think the other part, and Mike kind of alluded to this as well, is that this is probably already being used in most organizations today, whether they like it or know it or not. So one of the things to kind of sit down and think about is, how do I start to kind of put a wrapper around some of this and make it something the business can use? Um, a lot of this has to be an agreement, with between the business and technical leaders. That's really where this conversation has to start. So I think one of the areas that I always like to kind of kick off that conversation with is have an open conversation. Mike will talk a little bit about kind of how you can establish some teams and groups to do this, but I found kind of one of the most like grassroots methods to help determine this is ask the users. Go out there and survey the users. Ask them what they're, how they want to use it, how they are using it today, because we know it's out there. And obviously, as Mike alluded to earlier, that also produces some privacy challenges and some other concerns. So, there are some tools out there to help identify usage as well. If you're leveraging a tool like a web proxy, or a solution like an umbrella, for instance, you can generally get some visibility in it. I find that it's valuable to use that visibility, see who's using it, go back to those sets of users, see kind of what they're kind of going in and leveraging this for. What challenges are they helping to solve today? And Microsoft's front, since it's one of my expertises, there's tools like data security posture management for AI, which is kind of very specific to Gen AI platforms as a whole. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to use information that's already out there. I know I personally use it. I use Copilot every single day within my business context, but I also use ChatGPT every single day in my personal context, whether it's to, plan a driving route, whether it's to plan a trip, whether it's to go ask questions about some open content. So, I think one of the biggest things is just getting your hand around it, and just, making an agreement with the business on how, to approach this, because, as Mike alluded to again earlier, this isn't going away. This is a very hot topic.
Yeah, Rich, I think one thing that you highlighted that's why Gen AI is so unique is pretty much everybody's using it, right, for one form or another. And I think so, the concept of seeking to understand in the information security role, it's not a new one, but I think what's different about this that Mike and you've now touched on as well, Rich, is it's the extended use, how many different use cases there are, and it's how much is permeating through the business. And what discovering those use cases, it does really require an understanding so that you can position an effective governance strategy. And so, yeah, seeking to understand is a big piece. I also think, kind of moving over to Mike, looking at the governance piece, right? Like, while governance is not new concept, the technology is so new, and some of the ways that we may want to approach governance when it comes to security and our strategy, security governance and strategy behind securing the Gen AI may need to look a little bit different. So, Mike, can you kind of walk us through some techniques, some things you're seeing with your clients of how to build a strategy and some of the things that people may want to think about when we're looking at governing and securing Gen AI?
Sure, absolutely. So as Rich was saying, there's such a variety of uses for this. I've never seen anything in my entire career that's been this expansive and this deep as far as touching technology and touching businesses. Whether it's legal firms looking to build contracts or writing code that's going to be put out into production systems, or intelligence information, or whatever the case might be, they're all being touched on. And the biggest thing I'm afraid of, and what I'm hearing from my customers too, is they think it's something new. And now we have to come up with all these new protections, when at the end of the day, it's kind of just the opposite of that, in that we can't let our guard down on what we already have in place as far as information security goes. In fact, we need to double down and make sure that all the windows are locked and all the doors are watertight, and all of our processes that we've already got around identity, around vulnerability, around networks, the stakes are going through the ceiling. And that's without even coming into some of the techniques and processes that are coming out of this that we now have to defend against. So the stakes have gone up. That's it, end of the day. So as far as coming into a governance strategy, everybody needs to kind of stand back and say, how is AI being used across their organization? And what does that really look like? And we talked a little bit about the types of AI before, but generative AI in particular, you really need to understand where it's at, because now all of your content is at risk. All of your data potentially could be at risk as long as it's exposed to AI. So building your own strategy that kind of comes along with that, each one's going to be unique. We have challenges here in Netrix that I didn't have in my prior company in entertainment, but we had totally different stuff that was over there because of the content that we were creating.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think one thing that you've highlighted there, Mike, is Gen AI, what it has access to, right? And what content it may be able to expose. That comes back to your general security practices that you already have in place that may potentially already be a little weak in their own strategy, right? And Gen AI is just going to sort of compound that concern. It can get access faster and give someone unintentional access, right? And so that's your concept of rely on the basics that you're talking about there, is just kind of thinking through, okay, if it did have access to this, is my existing security policies or my practices in that particular space secure? And if not, then that's probably need to go back to that first, right? Yep. The tool is just compounding that problem. That's really the reality, is your existing risk or concern you had in that space is actually still there. It's now just a wider chasm. Right. And so we kind of think about there, like, okay, security programs and compliance programs that would align to your governance strategy, right? What are some of the considerations and some of the things that you think about that you would put into a security program, or some of the compliance angles in a client or for your own companies that you've managed, Mike, related to Gen AI use, compliance policies, and then some of the security program basics?
Yep. Yeah, and you know, as we were just talking about, I mean, I believe that we really need to understand our business. We need to know it inside and out. As Rich was saying, we need to work with those customers across the board, whether they be IT or who, you know, the various portions that are doing delivery or whatever the case might be. What are the frameworks that we're going to need to address? Because now, as we dive down into Gen AI, things really start to get complicated. You get into GDPR or NIST or whatever the case might be. The amplification is going to go way up. So my first recommendation right out of the bat is making sure you got clear policies, that not only do you have AI policies, but your other policies are nice and solid too. This is going to be really huge. You know, things like data handling. What are your security requirements? What's your third party, et cetera. You want to make sure all that stuff is tightened up. Two, you need to understand your risk, and you need to put that front and center and say, where is my risk really? And make sure that not only do I have the policies in place, but Rich is going to get a little bit more into some of the protections that we can put in place too. And this all goes hand in hand. There's really nothing new here except making sure that we understand the shared risk that's going on. Next thing you're going to want to do, training. Train. We all have a lot to learn. We just adopted a genius into the family, and we don't know a lot about what they know about, except they know everything. And our employees, as always, are our first line of defense from a security perspective. We can't have security teams that, you know, double the size of the development teams or whatever the case might be. So all the folks across the board are going to need good, strong training. And then last is really kind of going into the privacy and the compliance that goes along with it. As I mentioned, you know, some of the frameworks that are out there. We need to remember that there's going to be audit requirements, accountability requirements. We need to look at our configuration management a completely different way. Not are we doing configuration management on our IT systems or our security systems, but also our AI systems. Making sure that we're doing risk assessments, both of ourselves as well as the people that we're working with. So our third parties and everybody else, our risk has just expanded considerably. Our system protections, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm just going to keep beating this because this is really, really, really important. We want to make sure that the basic protections are in place, and then whatever enhanced protections we're going to put in place to do our continuous monitoring and stuff like that, those are all dialed in. I'm going to mention again, training. I think that there's going to be a major requirement that's going to go across the industry, and those who don't know are going to be the ones who get hurt. Things like DLP. We need to be watching what information's coming in, what information's going out. Is it coming from a known or an unknown source? And I think Rich is going to maybe touch on some of this other stuff too, but I'll throw it out there too. Things like model explainability. So if I'm using this generative code, how did it get to this assumption? What really happened here? You want to make sure your IR practices and your run books and all the stuff that goes along with those, that we've got those specifically in place that address things from an AI perspective. Ethical use and is something that's relatively new as far as us having to worry about it from an IT perspective, but there's going to be means and algorithms that we're going to have to be watching to say what data is being created and is it in fact in line with the guidelines we have. And the last one, and I think it's a really big one, is continuous monitoring. We may or may not have that in place today. Some of the better organizations have continuous monitoring in place, but we're going to need not just continuous monitoring of our systems, but also of our content and the data, the underlying data that's underneath it, because things like data poisoning can happen that you'll never see until you go and try to go back and write a contract off of some base set of paragraphs or whatever the case might be and find out that they're changed.
Yeah, it's great overview, Mike, that you highlighted through that of you're kind of hitting the core pillars of foundational security elements, and each one of those areas you kind of need to augment a little bit with flavor of AI, right? So making sure it's in your policies, thinking about your risk management and what how you incorporate Gen AI into that, employee training, your compliance practices, right? So it's definitely not a one-stop fix. It is a fully needs to integrate into your security program. And I think one thing I heard you did call out training a lot, Mike. Some of this stuff can be overwhelming for people, for security folks of like, okay, it's new, but I think starting with the basics, Mike, is something that I hear our CISO team say a lot when it comes to getting this stuff, and so there is this concept here of like, hey, embrace it and start somewhere, right?
Right.
And you can start basic. I mean, when you talk about our clients and things that you see, Mike, is a good place to start here is start small and kind of span out and not get overwhelmed. I think it can be overwhelming. So you have any feedback on that?
Well, and again, I think it's very critical that security organizations and CISOs in particular really are in touch with their business, and they're really in touch with the processes that they have going on. Probably more important now than ever. Who's approving AI tools? Okay, this is I think going to be a real wild card across an organization, because now you've got to establish this responsibility framework, and it needs to be a collaborative effort. That's a big deal. Who's signing off on this stuff? What about the safe usage of these tools? What are we doing? And I said it before, and I'll say it again. I think it's worth bringing up is the training that comes along with it. How do we use it? When do we use it? What is it used for? Making sure that we have these things. Making sure we're super vigilant about our orchestration and our content, and really knowing our data. In the past, I think some organizations have been a part of, IT and security aren't really that, they don't have that great of an understanding about the depth of the content or the consumption of the content. And now we've got to be real partners in this, because we have to put the tools in place. And as I mentioned before, setting up the continuous monitoring of this stuff. What content's being generated? Do we have leaks? What about our IP? Where is our IP, and do we still have control over that? Is there copyright infringement? Is there plagiarism opportunities there? Rich is going to talk about a couple of other things about, various types of attacks that can come into place, and, even the way that AI is putting the content together from a bias perspective. So yeah, there's a lot to talk about there, but those are really my starts to talk about from a basic. Get your arms around who's approving, and how is it really being used across the organization, so you know how to protect it.
Yeah, and that's helpful, Mike, because it is one of those, such a wide topic of like, okay, we got to start somewhere, right? And getting that business understanding, and then seeing where the security program can start integrating with that is definitely an easier place to start before you bring that in and start integrating it through your whole program. And then you've kind of laid out some foundational elements to start integrating Gen AI security into your overall program. So really great tie on governance there, and then how to integrate into the program itself. So let's within that, so we touched on protection a few times through that conversation. So I want to shift the conversation a little bit there. We talked a little bit about getting in front of the business and then bringing it into your program, but there is a real threat in some cases, and/or you're trying to get a deeper understanding, and protections or technology to help with that is a big area. And so when we talk about protections and the use of Gen AI, that can go in a few different angles. So we'll kind of maybe walk through a couple of those, and I want to kick that over to Rich. If we look at some of the basics like infrastructure security around how Gen AI is used, can you, Rich, maybe highlight some things that people should be considering in that space?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, obviously, there's so many different platforms and systems out there, right? You've got your SaaS vendor that has some built in. You've got third-party open source like anyone can just go to OpenAI's public site and start pumping things into ChatGPT. You've got Bing, that has AI built in. I always say start with the basics. Earlier I mentioned kind of try to wrap your hands around like what is being used and how it's being used as a starting point. Once you kind of have that started, the next step is to start thinking about how can I secure some of those systems. So a lot of times that may be through APIs, through single sign-on, through multi-factor authentication, just to kind of secure the user access and who can and should and be allowed to use what. In first-party systems, there's a lot more knobs and buttons to turn, right? If we talk about like Copilot as an example, a lot of that becomes kind of internal, like little dials and switches that you're flipping. One thing that comes up pretty often when I talk about integrating with third-party solutions is certainly ChatGPT. As an enterprise, I will tell you, please don't let your users use the OpenAI ChatGPT. Go get a couple licenses of ChatGPT Enterprise. It's going to allow you to integrate with SSO and MFA. It's going to allow you all the audit, and telemetry details about how it's being used, et cetera. And certainly because Microsoft's invested in them, there's a lot of really interesting integrations there as well. So try to extend that to whatever systems and platforms you can. Some cases you're going to be somewhat limited because, again, maybe in a kind of tied within a vendor's solution or catalog you can't really control, but for what you can get that visibility into and that access level, try. That's kind of where I like to start. I also look at, things like network security, IAM, vulnerability management, make sure you're kind of building this in your risk register, certainly. And then Mike mentioned this a couple of times, but I'll double and triple down. Anywhere you can get that monitoring and logging is going to be important. I'll say that I made a mention of this earlier in the webinar, but Microsoft has a newer tool. It used to be called AI Hub, now DSPM, or Data Security Posture Management for AI, which can detect the use of third-party AI, Gen AI platforms. Even just detecting how many people are using Copilot, obviously first party, but also Grok and Gemini and ChatGPT and others. Getting that visibility becomes extremely important because that kind of parlays into the data security side as well, and something you can use to help with that.
It's a good call out, Rich. I mean, I think kind of harkening back to our discussion on seeking to understand, ideally, you're able to get the business leaders to help identify it, but a lot of your end users are using it for their day-to-day business needs. Some of the leadership may not be aware of that, right? So even those conversations could fall down because they just may not be aware that the person in their team is using it for their job, right? And so some of the monitoring tools, and you and I have looked at some of the Microsoft tooling reports, they give you a very nice spread of like, hey, here's which Gen AI tools are being used, how often queries are being made, and you can take those directly back to business leaders and say, hey, there's folks in your team using these. Can we understand these use cases, right? So that I think you did highlight well, like just getting some of that visibility. Mike also talked about it, and being able to do a little bit of reporting on that usage. You can actually use that for those business conversations and just trying to identify what's happening. And then you can also identify unfortunate use where maybe it's not good use potentially through that as well. Yeah. That may be a more tactical conversation, right? But I think it's to seek to understand first, figure out what's happening, right? And so, yeah, I do want to touch a little bit deeper, Rich, on the data security and privacy topic. You kind of got into that on the tail end of what you brought up on the last topic. I would say from our standpoint and what we're seeing with clients, data security and privacy, Mike, you talked a lot about this as well. One of the biggest concerns, right? And that's mainly because if the person sitting at their desk has access to it, Gen AI also has access to it, and in a way more deep and intelligent way that a human couldn't find on their own. And that is the concerning element. So can you kind of walk us through things like data leakage protection, kind of data handling as it relates to Gen AI, and like what are some of the things that you're seeing with our clients, Rich, and then some considerations you would suggest for people to look at?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, right? So you made a previous mention to it, and I think Mike did as well. But I think one of the important parts is, as you just said a few minutes ago, if you can see it, Gen AI can see it. For things like Copilot and others, which becomes interesting, right? So even before we get into things like data loss, we think about what is the visibility of these tools. So a lot of times when we go into engagements where customers are looking to leverage Gen AI platforms, a lot of it starts with what can it see first, and making sure you start to implement process and technology and policies, which we'll talk about in a little bit, to help secure that. The next step then becomes, well, how do I make sure that even if I do allow users that have access to that content, how do I protect that? And that's where data loss and data leakage prevention come into play. And I'll kind of use that interchangeably. They both technically are DLP, but they kind of perform slightly different purposes. In the data leakage prevention scenario, it's, it could be malicious intent, it could be non-malicious intent. So one is we want to protect our users from doing something that they don't realize, right? I think the most common and well-documented example are publicly, where there was a very large, well-known tech manufacturing firm, and a developer, put in some very secure source code into the public, ChatGPT, and then due to some insecurities at the time, that was then leaked. That's the type of things we want to prevent. And now in that case, the user probably didn't know any better, but two is, there were some insecurities in other ways that that should have been detected before that even became an issue. Then we have kind of like the more malicious intent side. So this is, usually called like insider risk or insider threat. In these cases, we need to be able to identify when there is sensitive data. And what I always tell my customers is sensitive data can mean anything. It doesn't just have to be a credit card number or a driver's license number or a passport number. It could be something that's sensitive to your business, maybe not even in intellectual property, something about a merger and acquisition, something coming up about a quarterly earnings report. This is really where kind of that control and knowledge of what your data is, but then also the identification of that data. So a lot of times when we talk DLP, it's not just about the sensitivity of the data as it pertains to a pattern or a type, but also the type of content, and that's really where things like data labeling and data encryption come into play. A lot of times when we do like co-pilot engagements, it's always preceding that's going to be like a data protection workshop where we kind of help the customer understand, where does that data sit, should it be protected, should we even implement maybe a label so that AI cannot see that portion of the data, are things that we specifically talk about. There's also the secure data handling side as well. So again, how do I allow this content to be shared and stored? As I just mentioned a few minutes ago, there's kind of the encryption side of it as well. And also access controls. We excuse me, we often see scenarios where we may control access to specific subsets of data, and that may also make it not available for things like Copilot to reason or leverage as well. The visibility I mentioned is also extremely important. So I always recommend, where possible, if the vendor that has a kind of a black box solution for Gen AI, if they have telemetry we can get from that, try to bring that into a SIM or centralized logging platform. And once you kind of go through what Mike said earlier, once you kind of establish a governance committee, you start to make decisions on what the approved platforms are. Start to look at funneling those users into a specific set of those platforms. And that can be done a variety of ways. I'm not going to get necessarily into the bits and bytes of how that's done, but making sure they can only access what is approved from specific devices, ensuring that then can only access specific data, becomes an important process. So also be aware in that scenario of like, what type of devices are your users using? I imagine most are probably not on corporate laptops only anymore. They're maybe not just in a VDI instance. You also need to think about, the devices here, your phones, because there may be limited access that they can copy and paste something from that to the ChatGPT app on their mobile device as well. So these are all things I look to think about. And then certainly the ethics and insider risk side as well. Mike made some good mention of this earlier, but there's some ethical parts of how AI is used. And once you have some of the visibility, you can start to look at and judge. And even within tools like DSPM for AI, there's even policies that can look for like threatened type of language, right? Querying too much, looking for salary information, looking for this or that. Those become parts of some of the tools. And as you're thinking about and evaluating the tools you're looking to bring into your enterprise, I would absolutely make sure that's part of it, because that is one of the riskiest behaviors. And whether it's properly a malicious insider or whether it's just a breached user account, which is unfortunately still happens very often. As soon as I open up the door for that breached user to have access to Gen AI, then that can become a risky user very quickly. So, again, this is no small task or feat to think about, and it is a process, and you do have to kind of crawl, walk, run to kind of get there. But those are kind of the things I'm thinking about when it comes to protection within a lot of these where do I start type of conversations.
Yeah, really a good focus on DLP and data protection itself, Rich. One of the things that you highlighted too is about ChatGPT, purchase an enterprise license, right? And so you kind of have to think of your data at risk in a couple different angles here too, right? So for your approved Gen AI tools, do you have the right controls in place to prevent unintended access to data or data leakage through that? But then for those tools themselves, do you have to worry about data leaking back, and how are those tools secured, and what's happening around those tools, right? And so we get into a little bit of the concept of model security, right? And what is the tool, who's it produced by, what infrastructure does it rely on, and so maybe Rich, you kind of, I know that's a extremely deep topic, right? But just you can go really down into like a tinfoil hat zone when it comes to Gen AI and hallucinations and stuff like that. But what are some of the things, maybe some of the common things to look at when you're thinking about like model security, Rich, that you're working with clients on today, and just kind of what are some considerations when you're approaching using a specific model?
Yeah, I mean, one is considering how that model is sourced, built, managed, maintained, operated. I mean, is usually question number one, right? I think I see this, we see this all the time, right? And I think as a consumer myself of many SaaS services, 20 to 30% of them have some type of AI chatbot built in, whether it's, me going to my bank website, whether it's me going into, pay a bill, whether it's me checking on, the status of a trip with Airbnb. Like these all are, these all have potential implications to everyone, right? And not just from an enterprise perspective. So I think one is there's an adversarial component to this. So if you think about the scenario of who you're looking to leverage that data from, how are they securing their model? How do they make sure that there's not harmful or bad outputs, right? Answering a question that's very direct. Mike made a mention of this earlier, but kind of understanding the source of that data as well. Do I really want something that's being sourced, an answer being sourced from Wikipedia, when anyone else out in the world can really edit that on the fly, or do I want it sourced from an authoritative source? So, and a lot of times, with especially some of the kind of the boxed up solutions in some of these SaaS products, you don't necessarily have control over that. So the best thing you can do is certainly understand and try to talk to your vendor, talk to the provider, understand how that data is sourced and modeled, and make sure that again that is providing relevant and good information, something that is pertaining to what you're looking for. Also, we're seeing adversaries use Gen AI today. I think we actually, Adam, you and I talked about this in our last webinar as well. I think another important topic is how are others using this? It's very easy for me today to go download Llama and have it build a script to go breach an environment based on the CVE. So I think there's a defense part of that as well, to understand how adversaries are using that, to how you can also use things like Gen AI to help defend yourself as well. And then another part, I talked a little bit about kind of the access control side as well. For some cases, it's for some cases of Gen AI, it's easy as applying a license, right? If we think about the Microsoft world, I know all of us here have access to Copilot, for instance. You kind of just assign that, and it kind of just works. But when you're considering access to other platforms, you may want to look at other IAM or SSO or multi-factor controls to make sure that only authorized users have access to it. For instance, you may say that there's a specific platform. We'll pick Gemini as an example. Maybe that Gemini model is trained specifically on HR information, right? And you kind of got an HR bot and some Gen AI stuff that's happening there. You may require that specific users to go ask that bot or ask that Gen AI model questions have to elevate to a specific group or to a specific app. That is a very real, option these days. It doesn't just have to be an all or none proposal, especially when you kind of circle back to some of the comments I made earlier today on, using that funnel approach. That funnel approach doesn't mean that 100% of people follow the same funnel. There's certainly a model where you may have some little, deviations for specific business cases or units, or even personnel, because of the type of content they deal with as well. So I would take all of these into play, Adam. So from a model security perspective, get what you can, secure what you can. Try not to use the open platforms that are out there, especially from an enterprise perspective. So you kind of reiterated it, I said it earlier, but I'll reiterate once more. go buy a single license or two of ChatGPT Enterprise just to get the enterprise visibility. That alone is going to provide you the value that you may not get if you're kind of putting it into some of the open platforms.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, the industry is pretty new in this space. So even the more reputable vendors, they may find things that they didn't know about the use of AI and that they're going to fix. But sticking to some more reputable vendors where you're paying to get a little more visibility and you can have some transparency to their practices is kind of paramount right now. Some of the open AI stuff that's out there, while very powerful, scary, right? You have no idea what's potentially behind it. You get good output, but your inputs are going somewhere, and if you don't know where they are, then that is difficult to accept from a security perspective.
Yeah,
awesome.
Just an interesting note on that too. Your vendors that have kind of a black box AI solution, they could be just using ChatGPT, or they could be using Grok, or they could be using Gemini as well. Sometimes they will, and sometimes they won't expose that. So try to press on them, because that's also comes back into the importance of model poisoning and other things like that may happen as a result of you just using that on a day-to-day basis as well.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a little bit of a harken back to Mike's comment about some of your security program basics, right? So looking at third-party risk management, using some of your general questions, Mike, I assume, looking at how to augment those questionnaires, that probably comes up with your clients today. Is that an area you've been diving into?
Yes, it is, and it's relatively new, and there's a lot more questions than there are answers. And again, I think that the place to fall back to from, what's the first steps that I take? Again, use your head and go back and say, how tight are my governance criteria? Even the third-party risk management. Where is that data coming from? Where was that model developed? What sort of controls do they have, especially if you're going to be using it to run your business? So it's definitely an across-the-board game changer from the perspective that we now have to pay attention to a lot of stuff in much more specific ways than we ever had to before from a governance perspective.
That makes sense. So, with that, I think we're going to wrap the webinar. Mike and Rich, really appreciate you guys walking through. I'll kind of do a little bit of recap. When we talk about this broad topic, and the big thing, Mike highlighted is it's not going away, right? So the faster security leaders are able to align to their business, understand those use cases, identify why Gen AI is being used, and then work to put some basics in place in their governance and their security programs as far as strategy goes. The better off you're going to be on having an effective way to start securing the use of that Gen AI. Rich highlighted very well kind of seeking the understanding, and that goes beyond maybe just talking to business leaders where you try to align, right? Getting a little bit of understanding of how it's being used, using some tooling. Rich provided a few examples of how do you actually figure out who's using it, and that can actually give you a little more insight. And then on top of that, then looking at, okay, what are the protection mechanisms that you can apply? Rich and Mike gave a few examples of different areas, right? But I think the underlying theme here is, while the technology is new, application of security and the techniques are not necessarily new, right? A lot of your basics and some of the areas of security that maybe were already a concern or things you knew you were supposed to be looking at are compounded here, right? So double downing on your strategy, but then augmenting your program to incorporate elements of Gen AI while maybe keeping it basic to get started and aligning to your business. Those are some of the key areas that you guys highlighted, and I think that gives a really good place for people to start on this broad topic. Last thing I want to say before we close out is we do review the questions in the webinar. This being such a wide topic, we kind of hit the high level of each of the areas between governance and protections. But anybody who has any questions or other areas of topics they wanted to hear when it comes to securing Gen AI, please put them in the questions and answers, and we will try to answer those and follow up with you offline. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thanks.
Thanks.